Hello and welcome. My name is Beverly Popek, and I'm a Supervising Compliance Officer at the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement, City and County of San Francisco. Our office is here to help you understand your labor compliance requirements. This presentation is part two of a video series, and this presentation is relevant if you will or if you have employees performing work on the City and County of San Francisco contract, and those employees are working physically in the city and county of San Francisco? If the answer is yes, this video is for you. If not, you can skip this video and go to part three. San Francisco International Airport leaseholders, this information in part two is not applicable to you because the San Francisco International Airport is not located in the city and county of San Francisco. Therefore, citywide labor laws don't apply and you don't have to look at that. So you can also skip to part three. Everyone that's here with me, joining me, continuing on, how can you get the most out of this video? Remember that this video is a part of a series. You should have watched part one, the introduction first, and you should have your draft list with you. You are going to need to watch part three to really complete the series. And please print out the presentation slides that accompany this video. You're going to be thankful that you have them so you can mark them up, and you can also get some good ideas on your next steps. It's also a great place to take some notes. Now, recapping. In the city and county of San Francisco, we have two major types of labor laws, citywide and contract. Citywide labor laws are required for all businesses who operate and have employees in the city and county of San Francisco. Contract labor laws are required for companies who have a contract with us. By a contract, it can be a contract for services where we are paying you to provide services for us. It can be a lease where you're renting space from us, a permit, etc. So now let's start looking at this question. The question of what if you have a city and county of San Francisco contract and you're operating in the city and county of San Francisco? Which laws should you follow? Because as we noted in part one, there are contract and citywide laws. You had a glimpse of the list of laws there, and there's quite a bit. It can be very confusing. The methodology and the point of this all is to start to look at your contract requirements first. That's what you should always do to see if you have to comply. Then if you don't have to comply, then you're going to look at your citywide labor laws. That is essentially it from a high level. But let's dig into this particular process further, or the methodology. Um, when you have contract in the citywide labor laws, you have to ask yourself which contract laws apply to you. And as you look at each contract law, figure out if you are a covered employer. And if you're a covered employer based on the definition of that particular labor law, then you need to ask yourself if you have any covered employees. If the answer is yes, then you're going to comply, follow the contract labor law, its requirements, and look at all the options. But if the answer is no, then you need, and you are operating in the city and county of San Francisco, meaning you have employees working there, then you need to follow and look to the citywide labor laws and go through that same equation again of if they apply to you, if you're a covered employer, and ultimately, do you have any covered employees? That is the method that we're going to go through in many of our examples today. This may seem very repetitive, but this is how it is. And by the end of part two here, you are definitely going to get it. So let's see here. Now, when we look at our contract and our citywide labor laws, there are places where the contract labor laws takes precedence or trumps the citywide labor laws, which means that you wouldn't have to do both. You do one, not the other. But which one goes first? It only happens in some specific circumstances, and I want to define that. So first things first, it's when the minimum compensation ordinance is in play. The minimum compensation ordinance takes precedence over the citywide labor laws of minimum wage ordinance and paid sick leave, meaning if you have to comply with the minimum compensation ordinance, you're a covered employer, you have covered employees, then even if you're operating in the city and county of San Francisco, that is a labor law for you, and it takes care of um, the wage and also the paid time off requirements. Therefore, you don't have to comply with the minimum wage and the paid sick leave ordinance. So that's one particular situation. The other situation is when you have to comply with the healthcare accountability ordinance. Healthcare accountability ordinance takes precedence over the citywide labor law of healthcare security ordinance. And those names are super close and super similar. There's always a lot of confusion, so be very careful to understand which one's which, and make sure you know that you start with Healthcare Accountability Ordinance, HCAO, first, because that is the contract labor law. Now, we are going to really look at these relationships and interactions quite a few times through several examples, so it's okay if you don't understand it right now. So let's go into the minimum compensation ordinance versus minimum wage and paid sick leave. You have a contract with the city and county of San Francisco, and you're operating in the city and county of San Francisco, meaning you have employees working here in the city. So what do you do first? Which laws do you follow? Look to the contract laws, and under this particular example, take a look at the minimum compensation ordinance first. If you have to comply with this law, meaning you're a covered employer and you have covered employees, then that's it for you. That's what you do, and that's the law you follow. However, if you look at the minimum compensation ordinance, the contract law, and for whatever reason you don't have, you're not a covered employer, for example, then you're going to look at our basic citywide laws of the minimum wage and the paid sick leave ordinance. Drilling down further into this same example, here we have again the minimum compensation ordinance, where if you have to follow it, meaning you are a covered employer and you have covered employees, and then you need to comply, you need to follow the contract law, which is the minimum compensation ordinance. But if part of that answer is no, and you do have employees working in the city and county of San Francisco, then you need to look to the citywide labor laws, and that would be the minimum wage ordinance and the paid sick leave ordinance. So these are the laws that interact together, and you should put a note next to that. Let's move on to the healthcare laws. The healthcare accountability ordinance versus the healthcare security ordinance. Same scenario, you have a city and county of San Francisco contract, and you're operating in the city and county of San Francisco, meaning you have employees doing work in the city and county of San Francisco. So which laws do you have to comply with? Which law do you have to comply with? So you start again with the contract labor law. And the contract labor law for this situation is the healthcare accountability ordinance. Please note that there's a little asterisk next to the healthcare accountability ordinance. This is because if you have a grant agreement, that's a type of agreement that nonprofits have, then grants are exempt from the healthcare accountability ordinance. In other words, nonprofits who have grants, and for those employees working on those grants, there is no healthcare accountability ordinance requirement, and you just have to look to the healthcare security ordinance. So this is the identical methodology as we did before with the minimum wage versus the excuse me, the minimum compensation ordinance versus the minimum wage and paid sick leave scenario or example we had before. Just look at the contract requirement first, see if you're a covered employer and if you have any covered employees. If it's yes and yes, then that's the law for you that you need to follow. If the part of it is no, then you need to move on down to see if the citywide labor law applies to you. And for the healthcare accountability ordinance, that's how, for this slide, this is how you would do it. Now let's drill down into the deep details or more details with HCAO and HCSO. Looking here again, we're going to look at the healthcare accountability ordinance. That is the contract law that's required. The covered employer definition, if you're for profit, you have 20 employees or more anywhere in the world. If you're nonprofit, you have 50 employees or more anywhere in the world. So let's say yes, that's all correct. And then the question is, do you have any covered employees? Now, the definition for covered employee under the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance is someone who works 20 or more hours a week on the contract. So if the answer is yes, then you need to follow or you need to comply with the healthcare accountability ordinance. If the answer is no, then and the employees working in the city and county of San Francisco, there is a labor law for them and for you to follow, and it is the citywide labor law, which is the healthcare security ordinance. So if you take a look at the healthcare security ordinance, the covered employee information or requirement is the exact same as the healthcare accountability ordinance. So that's super easy and super convenient. But looking at the definition of who's a covered employee, if anyone's working 8 to 19 hours per week in the city and county of San Francisco, whether it's on the contract or not, these employees are going to be covered under the healthcare security ordinance, meaning you as an employer need to comply with the healthcare security ordinance at bare minimum. We're going to take a look at 5 examples of which labor laws apply to various employers like for-profit, nonprofit, and of different sizes. And for all of these examples, the employees are working on the city and county of San Francisco contract. They're also performing work, all the work in the city and county of San Francisco. And this very third bullet point, please understand that these examples are a first draft of labor laws to look at. Depending on if you're a covered employer or if you have covered employees, you may have to comply with the citywide labor laws. Therefore, you may need to do another form of analysis to see what those are, those being the citywide labor laws. So let's dive into these examples and go through how this works. Example 1. This is a for-profit company with a contract to perform professional services. The employee count is less than 5 employees. So this is a very small employer, and under the contract labor laws, the contract requires the fair chance ordinance and salary history. And that's all. That is because this employer has less than 5 employees anywhere in the world. Now, are they done? Is that it? Do they have to do any other labor laws? The answer is, well, maybe and yes. So we look at the citywide labor laws, and under the citywide labor laws, even if you have less than 5 employees, you are going to have to comply with these 3 basic labor laws: the minimum wage ordinance, paid sick leave ordinance, and lactation in the workplace. So that's how a very, very tiny, small for-profit employer, this would be your particular start list. This is example number 2. It's another for-profit company with a contract to perform professional services. The employer count for this example is 20 or more employees. Now, the contract labor laws for this employer would be the minimum compensation ordinance, and then it would be the healthcare accountability ordinance. Now notice that I have a little asterisk here, and that's because just by the employee count, we know that this employer is a covered employer, but the question is still there, do they have any covered employees? And if they have any covered employees for the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance, then the answer is pretty simple for this employer that they need to comply with the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance for this law. However, if they don't have any covered employees for the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance, they need to look to the city-wide Basic Law of Healthcare Security Ordinance and see if they need to comply with that law for that particular employee or those employees. So remember now, this is just the first draft cut to get you started. You may have to perform further analysis. Moving back down the list for the contract side, the Fair Chance Ordinance and Salary History Ordinance, those are all requirements for the contract. And actually, I didn't mention this before in example one, but Fair Chance and Salary History Ordinance, they are also citywide labor laws that are requirements. But under the contract, there are different definitions that just requires all contractors to just comply. Um, Moving to the right-hand side, citywide labor laws. If this employer has 20 or more employees anywhere in the world, the labor laws that they would have to comply with would be the Family Friendly Workplace Ordinance, Lactation in the Workplace, and Paid Parental Leave. But check out again, as I said, the Healthcare Accountability Ordinance. If this particular employer has any covered employees, there might be another labor law here to add in terms of the Healthcare Security Ordinance. So that is something to factor in and keep in the back of your mind. Let's move to example 3. We're moving on to nonprofits, and this is a nonprofit example where this nonprofit has a contract to perform professional services. The employee count is 50 or more employees, and this is what we would say a large nonprofit. So the contract labor laws for this nonprofit would be the minimum compensation ordinance and the healthcare accountability ordinance. Here again, I've put the asterisk here under the healthcare accountability ordinance because we're not sure if there are any covered employees under the healthcare accountability ordinance. And if the answer is no, this particular employer has a duty to look to the healthcare security ordinance to see if their employees are covered under that basic citywide labor law before they say, I don't have to do anything at all for health requirements and benefits here. Again, we have the Fair Chance and the Salary History ordinances that round up the contract labor law list. On the right-hand side for citywide labor laws, this employer has 50 or more employees anywhere in the world. So we have the Family Friendly Workplace Ordinance, Lactation in the Workplace, and Paid Parental Leave. Example 4. This is another nonprofit example. This nonprofit has a contract to perform professional services, and the employee count is, say, 5 to 49 employees anywhere in the world. So under the contract labor requirements, we have the minimum compensation ordinance, and then we also have the Fair Chance and the salary history. Notice here that I don't list the healthcare accountability ordinance because if you take a look at the healthcare accountability ordinance, a nonprofit must have at least 50 or more employees anywhere in the world to be considered a covered employer. So that's why it's not showing up on the contract labor law list over here on the left-hand side. Turning our attention to the right side, the citywide labor laws, lactation in the workplace, family-friendly workplace ordinance, and paid parental leave. These are all potentials where this nonprofit may have to comply depending on if they meet the threshold count for lactation, for family-friendly and paid parental leave, which family-friendly and paid parental leave, you need to have at least 20 employees or more anywhere in the world. Now, our final example, which is example number 5, it is a nonprofit company with a contract that is a grant. So remember, this is for a grant, and grants are exempt from the healthcare accountability ordinance. The employee count is 50 or more employees. So the contract labor laws for this employer would be the minimum compensation ordinance, fair chance, salary history ordinances. On the right-hand side for citywide labor laws, it would be pretty much everything under here, which would be for a large employer, such as lactation in the workplace, family-friendly workplace ordinance, paid parental leave, and healthcare security ordinance. What are the next steps? Now that you learned how citywide and contract labor laws interact with each other, you're probably asking yourself, what do you do next? What you're going to have to do is you need to go back to your draft list of contract and citywide labor laws from part 1 and go in there and really determine which laws you need to comply with, the contract and or citywide laws, using the methodology and information in this video. So this concludes part 2 of our series. Continue to part 3, where we will dive into identifying positions and the labor laws that are relevant to such positions. This is our contact information, and our website is our ultimate and best source for phone numbers, email addresses, and information for our labor laws that we enforce. This was part 2 of a series, and I recommend that you watch part 3 to determine what questions you have before contacting us. As you are going through the process, remember that we are here for you, and if you'd like to reach someone who can assist you in understanding your overall labor requirements, you can contact us at the MCO and the HCO unit. If you do have a specific question or questions regarding one of our labor laws, please contact that unit directly and staff will be able to assist you. You can navigate to all of our labor laws throughout our OLSC website, which is listed here. Thank you again for joining me, and see you soon on the next video.